All right, so hello everybody. We're here with Gary Powers Jr., the author of Spy Pilot, Letters from a Soviet Prison, and Operation Overflight, three separate books. He's previously given us a book talk on Spy Pilot, and I wanted to say thank you for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to have you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Nikolai. It's a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to chatting with you about the two books I've written, Spy Pilot and Letters from a Soviet Prison. Operation Overflight, it was actually my dad's autobiography, and I had it republished about, 15 or 20 years ago now, and I wrote the epilogue for that book.
Ah, very good. So that's kind of where I wanted to start was you've got three books touching on the same subject, and I wondered, where would somebody who wants to dive in begin? Would you recommend reading one first? How do they differ, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, Operation Overflight was written by my father and co-author Kurt Gentry back in 1970. It was published. So that was my father's story based on his recollections, his memories, his journal, his diary that he kept in prison, and his personal experiences. In the 1968 to 1970 time period, when my father was writing that book, it was still the height of the Cold War. So he was not able to get access to declassified files or other information that has since become available. So in 1970, he wrote it basically to tell his side of the story as to what transpired with the U-2 incident and his involvement. My book came out in 2019 called Spy Pilot. It was 25 years worth of research to set the record straight. It takes my dad's reputation from infamy and controversy in the 1960s to that of an American hero today. And it goes through the process of how his reputation was transformed from infamy to that of an American hero. He basically has been awarded now posthumously with the POW medal and the Silver Star. So my book fills in the gaps and adds to what my father wrote some 40 some years ago now. So that book, Spy Pilot, you can get more information about it online at www.spypilotbook.com. My last book is Letters from a Soviet Prison. It also came out in 2019 officially through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online portals. But it actually was released in 2017 in a limited edition as a prerequisite to coming out with being published. So Letters from a Soviet Prison is basically my father's correspondence to and from his family and the journal he kept while incarcerated. So this was a primary source document that I assembled based on my father's letters, the letters and correspondence he received from his family while in prison, and the journal he kept while incarcerated. So I thought it was very important for the historical record to get my dad's thoughts and feelings, his hopes and despairs, his written word out there so that scholars and students in the future could read through his eyes, through his words, what he went through. So those are the three books that I have to my credit.
Great. And you're also closely associated with the International Spy Museum. Could you talk a bit about that and how that idea popped up?
I'm actually associated with three museums. Primary one is the Cold War Museum that I founded in 1996 to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate kids on this time period. I'm also an honorary board member on the International Spy Museum, located in Washington, D.C., been open for about 20 years now. It deals with espionage from biblical times up through modern day. So between the Cold War, which is from 1945 to 1991, it has some espionage components. The Spy Museum, from biblical times to current modern day, has overlap with some Cold War espionage intrigue. So those are the two museums that I'm affiliated with here on the East Coast. And then one other museum is the SAC, the Strategic Air Command and Aviation or Aerospace Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. So that is a third museum that I am affiliated with. I'm on their board of directors, and they are helping to keep the history of the SAC, Strategic Air Command, and the Cold War, and other aspects of Air Force military history alive for future generations.
It's clearly a very important topic to touch on and to preserve for future generations, but I'd like to hear your perspective. Why do you think espionage is so important? The history of espionage, rather, is so important to preserve and pass on.
It's a preserving espionage history is like preserving any other type of history. It is important for future generations to learn about what took place prior to their involvement, their existence. Espionage, quote unquote, is the second oldest profession. It has been around ever since the beginning. When we were first developing as humans, I'm sure that certain groups were looking and trying to spy about other groups. Where was the food source? Where's the water source? Where's safety or shelter? What is dangerous? Trying to figure out strengths and weaknesses of their opponents. I mean, before we were even humans. So espionage has always, I think, been ingrained in our society, ingrained in our psyche, to find out what others have, to find out the strengths and weaknesses of your adversaries. So it's very important to learn how the evolution of espionage happened. From the knights in the round table and the cloak and daggers and the spy guilds, up through now World War I espionage in Germany and France, to World War II over the lines with Hitler, trying to figure out their strengths and weaknesses. Where was the Allies going to land? Where was Hitler going to strike next? What country was he going to take over again or next? So it's very important to understand the history of this type of a subject matter. It's interesting. I mean, it accumulates with James Bond. I mean, James Bond, this fictitious heroine on the big screen, or the hero on the big screen, and it's all about espionage. So it's interesting, it's fascinating, and as some people will say, truth is stranger than fiction. The things that they've developed in the espionage arena, lipstick cases that fire bullets, shoe phones like in Get Smart. I mean, it has something for everybody.
Right, and you specifically mentioned kids with the Cold War Museum. How do they connect that history with kids specifically? Do they do? I'm sure they do plenty of unique stuff.
Well, one of the first things that school groups will see when they enter the Cold War Museum is a small display on civil defense. And they talk to the kids about the duck and cover drills that were done in the 1950s to safeguard Americans at home by practicing to duck and cover under your desk in the event of a nuclear bomb or a natural disaster. So that's one of the ways that we can connect the Cold War to kids. Another that we do when we do programs around the country is to show Cold War propaganda cartoons. And these cartoons were made in the 44 to 47 era by the US government to teach people and students about communism and capitalism, the difference, how our society works, and to try to instill in them the benefits of democracy. So we show these type of cartoons to kids because, hey, cartoons and kids, they go together. They get enthralled. They get interested as a cartoon gets their attention, and then they can learn a little bit about this Cold War history and the difference between our two ideologies, communism and capitalism, communism and democracy.
And as far as your dad's role specifically fits into the history of espionage, you do a lot of talks with us, of course, and with a lot of other museums, venues throughout the country. What do you think is the main takeaway from your father's life and his story surrounding the U-2 incidents? What is it that you hope to communicate to audiences when you give them your talks?
Well, primarily what I'm trying to convey to audiences is the truth of what took place. When I started my research to find out about my father after he passed away, I didn't start it to vindicate him. I did not start it to honor him. I was only looking for the truth, so I knew how to answer questions. People were curious. Oh, your dad's Gary Powers. What happened here? I've heard that. Is this true? Is that not? Did he have a flame out? Did he follow orders? Did he defect? I mean, people had questions. So I was wanting to find out the truth of what took place, so I knew how to answer these questions that were being asked of me. And that's what started me on this journey to find out about my father, the U-2 incident, and to help set the record straight.
Were people asking you those questions when you were a kid, and how did you deal with that?
As a kid, I was fairly aware that my father was shot down, imprisoned, and exchanged. I talked to my dad about this when he was living. So for me, it was normal. I didn't understand at the time how abnormal it was. My father dies in August of '77. I'm 12 years old. I find out about his death through family friends that meet us at the house. And all of a sudden, it's news. He's on the news, and his death is being reported. So that's when the light bulb kind of came on, going, wow, not everybody's dad gets shot down, imprisoned, or exchanged. Oh, and not everybody's dad has controversy around his actions. So this is when I really became aware of my father's role in history, was upon his death. But by that time, once he had passed away, I could no longer ask him any questions. And this is basically what set me on my path. In high school, I was very introverted. Didn't want to talk to people. I was kind of kept to myself. I just wasn't ready to talk about my father or to dive into that. But in college is when I came out of my shell. I was curious, wanted to find out more about my dad, what he went through. And so I started to do this research. So the research basically led me from California, where I grew up, to the Washington, D.C. area. I did my graduate degree at George Mason University in public administration, nonprofit management. Started to give lectures to high school students in the D.C. area in about 92 to 95 about the U-2 incident, my father, Cold War history. In 1996, I ended up founding the Cold War Museum to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate kids on this time period. So from there, it's just been a way for me to learn more about my father, learn more about the U-2 incident in Cold War history, and really to help honor veterans and educate kids.
I wondered if I might ask a bit about the fact that you were a kid growing up with such a historical father figure. You probably had a lot of, shall we say, media scrutiny surrounding your father's life. Do you have any advice for kids who might be going through something similar? Of course, they'll never be an exactly parallel situation, but if somebody who finds themselves in the middle of history like that.
Yeah, it's boy. As far as advice goes, I don't know if I have any advice right off the top of my head. It was a unique experience for me to grow up in the shadow of a famous figure. I could have, after my father's death, gone either way. Ended up as a hoodlum, or ended up as I am now. The high school for me was very challenging. I would sneak out at night. I would run the streets. I'd get home in the morning, early in the morning, sleep for an hour, then go to school. So I didn't have a father figure after my father died growing up. And my mom had her hands full, as you can tell. And so I'm very fortunate that my father and my mother both instilled in me at a very young age that I should try to do the best I can, to try to follow my dreams and my passion. Now, I was a little wayward for a while in high school. Never did anything, vandalism or things like that. But Dad was a spy, so that was really cool. So what do spies do? Oh, they learn to pick locks. So they learn to open doors. Well, as a result of learning these things, because Dad was a spy, I was able to sneak into my high school and get a final before it happened. So for me, these were youthful indiscretions that I was doing based on my family heritage. Other friends, their dads were doctors or lawyers or plumbers or carpenters or developers. I mean, it ran the gambit. But since my dad was a spy, that was a little different. Not everybody's dad is a spy. And so I think because of that unique family heritage and the fact that he died when I was 12, and the fact that there was some controversy around him and mom had her hands full, I could have really gone either way. I'm very fortunate that I had my mom there to help guide me. I had a very dear family friend, Greg Anderson, who I believe was one of my mentors, who really took me under my wing, his wing, and basically he's the guy who taught me to tie my tie since my dad wasn't around to do it. So I think I would advise for young people who are either their parents are in the limelight and or one of their parents in the limelight dies, to try to find a mentor, to have them take you under their wing, to make sure that you get some guidance as to how best to mature into an adult. Fortunately, I did have some of that guidance, and I did see the light, and I didn't go off and be a hoodlum per se. But I did experience youthful indiscretions and different things as a youth, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and then growing into a mature and adult.
It's something I hadn't considered. I guess we all sort of reflect our parents, look up to our parents. You're saying that as the son of a spy, you had a lot of habits that might not, well, that were quite unique, quite frankly. You mentioned picking locks. Where'd you learn to do that? Where did you go on your own, try to find out this information?
Yeah, basically, this is well before online videos where you can learn through YouTube, but I knew about locks. I read some books from the library. Dad had an old office desk and a filing cabinet. I started with a paper clip and then 2 paper clips and tried to move things around. And sure enough, I was able to get Dad's desk drawer open. It's like, okay, wow, that works. Other locks were more difficult, of course, and I never got a lock picking set per se, but I just fiddled with, little paper clips and tools and credit cards that you can put in between a door and a latch to jimmy it open. Things like that. You just kind of learn as a kid really quickly how to get into something that you want to.
Well, so it sounds like growing up in that atmosphere, it certainly has an effect on your worldview. Do you think it had an effect on your father's worldview that you noticed?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Dad's viewpoint of the world changed from the time he was shot down to the time he was returned. Prior to being shot down, he was and still was when he came home staunchly anti-communist. But as a result of being in prison and interacting with Russians, he developed a deep appreciation for their culture and for them as individuals and people. Dad realized that the Russians, the Soviets, were just like Americans. They wanted something better for their children. They were working hard. They wanted to make sure that they could provide for their families. So on a personal level, Dad realized that the Soviets and the Americans were just the same. But the difference was the ideological level, communism versus democracy. And so that's what was butting heads. That's what was causing the strife between our 2 countries, not the individual people.
Did he talk a lot about the YouTube incident, or was it a rare occurrence?
No, my father, you have to recall, was very shy. he was a fighter pilot, one of the best fighter pilots at the time, but he was still very reserved, did not like to speak in front of large crowds, was very an introvert in a way. So as a result of being shot down in prison, captured, front page news for 2+ years during the Cold War and then throughout the rest of his life, he forced himself to be able to speak in front of public. He wrote a book. As a result, he had to go on the lecture circuit. If you want to sell more books, you got to speak. So he was able to get over that fear of public speaking and was able to do lectures and talk about it publicly up until his death in 1977.
So you mentioned getting started on the research about your father. Where does one begin to acquire sources, etc.? Were the letters, for example, in Letters from a Soviet Prison, private property of your own? How does one begin cataloging your father's life?
Well, at first, one of the things I did was go to the library at Cal State Northridge, where I was attending school. I looked up in the Dewey Decimal System way back when, before the internet, different books on powers and U-2 incident. I discovered that my father was on the cover of Time magazine in May of '60. Never knew that as a kid growing up. Found out about it when I was in college because I found it in the university archives. So that's really what got me going on this research. So I started looking into books that were written, looking into periodicals and newspaper articles that were written through the old microfilm and microfiche machines. And then that led me out to Virginia in 1992. I wanted to get closer to the National Archives. I wanted to get closer to Washington, D.C. area where there were alumni associations of CIA, FBI, State Department employees. I wanted to be out here in the nation's capital so I could get access to these resources. And about this time in 92 to 96, when I'm starting to do this research, the internet's becoming available. It's getting online, email addresses and web pages starting to form. So I got my first email address back in 1996, and I still have it today, G Powers Jr. at Gary Powers at coldwar.org, G Powers Jr. at coldwar.org. And we were one of the, within a million times, we had one of the first million web pages out there when we got coldwar.org as our domain name. So once that happened and we have this Cold War domain, I'm doing this research on my father and the Cold War, things just start to snowball. What I discovered in doing research is that in order to understand about my dad, I had to know more about the U-2 incident. So that's where my research led. But then I realized, after asking questions and talking to people who were involved with the U-2 program and U-2 incident, I needed to know more about the Cold War to understand the U-2 incident, to learn more about my father. And so that's where my research then turned. So I started talking to military personnel, World War II veterans, Korean War, Vietnam War, Cold War veterans, trying to find out as much as I could about this time period so that I could learn more about the Overhead Reconnaissance Program, the U-2 program, the SR-71 program, the satellite program, that all have to do with this intelligence gathering operation. The signals intelligence, the electronic intelligence in the air, the overhead reconnaissance intelligence, bringing back photos, and it all kind of just morphed into an interest and a passion to make sure that I was learning the truth. I also decided it was important to make sure I received or earned a master's in U.S. history. So I did that over the last few years and graduated last year with my master's in U.S. history. So now I have, quote unquote, the credentials to show people and let them know that I am an expert in this field and that I have the credibility, not just because of Dad's name, but because of the research and the studies I have done.
I'm sure you met some interesting characters in the course of all that. Can you tell us a bit about a few of them?
Oh, yes. I've met many very interesting people along the way. One of the earliest memories I have right after my father's death in about 1977 or 78, I had the honor and privilege of meeting General Omar Bradley, who was one of the five-star generals of World War II. And my father had just signed a photograph to General Bradley, but he died before he could give it to him. So it fell upon me as Dad's son to present this photograph to the general in Pasadena, California at the Huntington Library. And so I go in, I'm in my little coat and tie, and I'm all of, I don't know how, 5'4" tall or something when I'm 12 years old. And I just have this vivid memory of meeting General Bradley. He signs a photograph of him in uniform to me. He takes off one of his five-star lapels, his insignia, and he gives that to me along with the photograph. So I have that on my office right now, office wall right now, and I'm looking at it. So that's one of the unique characters of history I met as a kid. In addition to others throughout my life, especially since I grew up in LA, California, right near Hollywood, I met an assortment of politicians, Hollywood actors, celebrities, and other individuals throughout my life. I had the privilege of meeting President Gorbachev about 10 years ago at George Mason University. When I was creating the Cold War Museum and some other things, I was able to attend a dinner and a little talk that he was doing there at George Mason. I've had the privilege of meeting several presidents of the U.S., several presidents of foreign countries, as well as individuals in all walks of life. I mean, it's just been a very unique assortment of individuals I've come in touch with throughout my career and my life.
Wow. You mentioned your graduate degree in history from, was it George Mason where you got your master's?
No, I had done two master's degrees. My first master's degree was in public administration, nonprofit management. I earned that degree in 1997 from George Mason University. And I spent the next, 13, 15 years in the DC area working for chambers of commerce, associations, nonprofit management type of things. I was doing that was my career in nonprofit management. Then in 2010, 2011, I decided to focus more on my passion, my interest in Cold War history, and to find out more about Dad and the U-2 incident. I started doing lecturing, writing, and teaching, focusing strictly on that, doing my two books, writing my books, and getting the word out. So that's when I decided that I wanted to get my master's degree in U.S. history so that I had that piece of paper, that credibility that came with the degree.
Did your master's in history require a thesis?
It did. And my thesis is basically my book, Spy Pilot, without all the fluff. So that's the thesis. I did two birds with one stone, and I was able to write my thesis, and then that was the basis for the book.
So how'd you get into contact with Sergei Khrushchev for that?
Yes, Sergei Khrushchev, another very interesting individual I have met, and who I am honored to call a friend. Sergei and I first met in about 1995, 1996 in Bodø, Norway. Bodø, Norway is the air base above the Arctic Circle where the U-2, my father's U-2 would have landed on May 1st had he not been shot down. So I meet Sergei Khrushchev at a Cold War conference in 1995-96. It's the first Cold War conference I'm aware of. I'm able to participate in it as a speaker. Sergei and I meet. We kind of eye each other up and down. We're not quite sure who this person is. We've heard so much about the fathers and all. But at the end of the day, we turn out that we have common interests. We are doing research. We are both historians. We are trying to honor our fathers. We're trying to find out the truth of what took place and try to work on he was working on getting his dad's memoirs published, and I was working on getting research to find out about my father to publish. So I mean, it was very unique to be able to see him and meet him, and eventually develop a friendship over time.
So do you have any future projects in the pipeline, or is there anything that you're working on currently?
I am slowed down a bit because of the coronavirus. I lost 40 lectures over March, April, May, June, July, August, and I am now in the midst of rescheduling, as well as looking for other lecture venues. If any of your listeners or patrons who are listening to this broadcast know the venue, please let me know. I'm always looking for venues in the Virginia area where I live, and of course out of state, as long as travel expenses can be covered. More information you can find online about my lectures, my books, and to get in touch with me at garypowers.com.
Okay, so can you tell us a bit about your spy tours of Washington?
Oh, yes. Well, this is a basic outing for people in the Washington, D.C. area. I can do private tours for small groups up to about 10 to 11 people in a passenger van, or I can charter a deluxe motor coach, 50 people, and then go around to drop points, safe houses, and other clandestine locations where spies were caught, captured, or killed in the D.C. area. It'd be from Civil War times up through modern times. We will see such places as Aldrich Ames' home, Alger Hess's home, Wild Bill Donovan's home. We'll go by CIA headquarters, or the FBI headquarters, or the National Reconnaissance Office, or some other intelligence agency there in the DC area. We have briefings on Civil War espionage, World War II espionage, as well as Cold War espionage. If clients would like to do a brown bag, they can order through one of the restaurants in the area, or we could do a white tablecloth or sit-down lunch or buffet at a restaurant en route. So there's a lot of options that we have for clients, and it's a great way to get out on a beautiful day to see Washington, D.C. and learn a little bit about espionage in the nation's capital.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You are quite welcome, Nikolai. I appreciate the time to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here soon again.
You as well.
All right, take care.